From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan with my co-host David Feldman and also the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. We've got a great show for you today. David, tell us who our guest is.
Our guest today is Bruce Fein, who has been called the most creative attorney in America. In his long career, Mr. Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel to the Federal Communications Commission under President Ronald Reagan. He has been a visiting fellow for constitutional studies at the Heritage Foundation, an adjunct scholar at American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Fein is also the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, and also American Empire Before the Fall. Ralph, please welcome Bruce Fein.
Delighted. Thank you very much, David. And Bruce, before I get to my first question, I do want to fill in a couple areas in your biography. You graduated from Harvard Law School in 1972. You were in the Reagan Justice Department. You were a policy advisor to Ron Paul's presidential run in 2012. And by now our listeners are saying, what are you doing having a Republican like that on the show? Very simple. I first got wind of where Bruce Fein stood on the issue of constitutional compliance and foreign policy when I heard he had a press conference where he asked for the impeachment of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. Bruce Fein is a Republican. He'd probably call himself a conservative libertarian, but he has a clear-eyed view about what the rule of law is all about. And in recent years, he has been ferociously writing op-eds, sending letters to members of Congress, to the White House, Attorney General, and his books are very compelling reflection of his determination that foreign and military policy must be adherent to the rule of law, starting with the generic document of the U.S. Constitution. And all three branches of government have got to uphold their oaths of office and perform their constitutionally authorized or indeed mandated role. So welcome, Bruce, and I want to put the first question to you. Why don't you clarify for the audience your concerns that certain patterns of behavior, especially under Bush Cheney and Obama Biden, have been clearly contrary to constitutional provisions, federal statutes, and international treaty conventions to which we were signatories, if not actually sponsoring for other countries to join, like the Geneva Conventions. Take it away, Bruce.
Yes, it'll be a concession to the shortness of life. That list can't be complete, but basically we have an era of lawlessness, whether by Republicans or Democrats, and it's a lawlessness that's initiated largely by the executive branch and acquiesced in eagerly by the legislative branch, while the judicial branch abdicates its responsibility to decide constitutional questions by raising technical issues of standing or otherwise. But let me begin the list, and the most important is the usurpation of the war power by the president. That is, no longer do we have Congress declaring war after the president and the American people make a case as to why we need to cross that Rubicon, a very high threshold, because war legalizes what's customarily murder. So you don't want to go to war lightly. Indeed, it was Alexis de Tocqueville said that anyone who wishes to destroy the liberties of a democratic nation ought to know that the surest and safest way to accomplish it is to initiate war. But presidents now go to war at their own doing. The president went to war against Libya after Colonel Gaddafi had abandoned weapons of mass destruction. The signal sent to Iran and North Korea is, you better not abandon your WMD, because we'll have a president come in and kill you and overthrow your government and turn it to shambles. The president at present, since at least September, has been running an unconstitutional war against so-called Islamic State and Syria and now Yemen, whose government doesn't exist and can't authorize our use of predator drones there. But that's number one, the usurpation of the war power. Number two, the president uses predator drones to kill American citizens on his say-so alone based upon secret evidence in violation of due process of law. In fact, that may be the most awesome claim to authority any president has ever made. He, on his own, can decide to kill anybody he wants in the entire globe, including U.S. citizens, based upon what the CIA or the NSA may tell him about your threat to national security. Then there's a third area of lawlessness, is the surveillance of the entire American population by the National Security Agency without any suspicion that any single member of the population is engaged in criminality or in international terrorism, a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment. And then we have presidents who, because they don't like the obligation to get a two-thirds vote in the Senate for treaties, makes military commitments abroad by executive agreement. That's what we've got in Afghanistan at present, 10,000 troops or more, executive agreements now with Iraq to redeploy troops in Iraq without any Senate ratification of any kind of treaty. So that's largely there on the foreign front, but it also bleeds over even into our domestic obligations. Take, for example, the clear, credible cases of torture that were disclosed by the recent Senate Intelligence Committee report on the CIA's use of enhanced interrogation techniques. Now, both Obama and his first Attorney General, Eric Holder, and the Attorney General designate, Loretta Lynch, have stated openly, waterboarding is torture. And it's documented that waterboarding was used over 200 occasions against al-Qaeda suspects, and yet there hasn't been a single prosecution, despite the fact that our adherence to the Convention Against Torture obligates every country to investigate every credible case of torture. And with regard to so-called claims of necessity or urgency, the Torture Convention and our own statutes explicitly state there are no circumstances that justify torture. No ticking time bomb, no necessity defense, none. And yet we have no investigation, despite the president's Article 2 obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And we have another instance where, in the preparation of the Senate Intelligence Committee report, the CIA broke in to the computers of the Intelligence Committee staff, a clear violation of the speech or debate clause. And yet Congress has done nothing to try to honor its integrity and shield from the executive branch, and President Obama has done nothing to punish or demote any of the CIA personnel who was involved in hacking in to a co-equal branches of government's investigatory files.
They got away with it.
Well, they got away with
it.
The same with the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, in 2013 lied to the Senate Intelligence Committee under oath when he said that the NSA was not collecting data on millions of Americans. He got away with it. The Senate did nothing. The President did nothing. Here we have criminality at the highest level going with impunity. Those just are some of them. I don't have time to go into all the details, but we can expand on them as we go forward. But we clearly have a case where the government lawlessness is truly, truly stunning to anybody whose birth is a baptism in Washington was Watergate, and participated in the ouster of a president who was told, no, when a president does it, it's not necessarily legal, and you may forfeit your office for obstructing justice or otherwise tolerating illegalities. And we've come, in my judgment, several quantum levels below that standard in now accepting lawlessness right in the White House.
Bruce, in terms of it getting worse, before we talk about how it damages our national security with blowback to all these illegal wars of aggression, torture, etc., it actually is making things more dangerous, more insecure around the world. Compare the investigation of CIA illegalities by the Church Committee, Senator Frank Church of Idaho, over 25 years ago, and the reaction to it then, compared to the Senator Feinstein's redacted report and 6,700 pages of backup, which is still secret, and the official reactions to her report, by way of just saying things are getting worse.
Yes, there's no doubt they're getting worse, Ralph. You know, the Church Committee, despite some claims at the out that if it investigated the CIA, we'd never have any cooperation, any intelligence sharing with any other country in the world, all ridiculous assertions. It was thorough. It was complete. It exposed the assassination attempts, amongst others. It exposed NSA illegal spying for law enforcement, not intelligence collection purposes, over long periods of time. For instance, one example, they were collecting every single international telegram ever that was sent from ITT and others without, in fact, they were collecting telegrams that were sent by members of Congress. And the Church Committee was the one who decided what documents would be declassified and disclosed to the public and what were not. It was 7 volumes, very, very comprehensive. It was largely bipartisan. And the result was we had a new statute. For the first time in history, they created a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and required warrants. Unfortunately, have been flouted by this administration. Warrants before the intelligence community could spy on American citizens in the belief that they were agents of foreign powers or somehow engaged in some nefarious activity. So the Church Committee reports were received with sobriety. The executive branch supported and signed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978. We created the first House and Senate Intelligence Committees to systematically oversee the intelligence community, unlike the period before that time when there was no oversight at all, which led to all the CIA's lawlessness and the NSA lawlessness. But it was viewed, Senator Church was viewed as a semi-hero. With regard to today, think of the opposite. One, unlike the Church Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee refused to decide whether or not it would release its own report. It sort of went hat in hand, like Henry IV at Canossa, to the Pope. Hey, please, executive branch, will you let us, report to the American people what we've discovered? The report was poo-pooed by the executive branch. President Obama, John Brennan, head of the director of CIA, saying, well, it may well be that we might have gotten some kind of intelligence that was helpful or not, and you've overstated, the amount of torture that was involved, an effort to resist changing anything in our interrogation programs, to resist prosecuting or even investigating the claims that Senator Mark Udall pointed out are lodged against persons who are currently working for the United States government. Totally different attitude, and indeed I think the American people largely were complacent with the torture that was inflicted upon the al-Qaeda detainees, at least according to public opinion polls. No outrage. And part of it, I think, is that the executive branch has concealed the fact that, number one, in undertaking these abuses, we set precedents for our enemies abroad to do it to our own officials, which is problematic. Number two, that we, by undertaking these kinds of torture programs, give license to al-Qaeda and Islamic State to use them as a recruiting tool to the disaffected youth throughout the Middle East. So we end up with more enemies than we possibly could have destroyed or captured through the use of these techniques. And it's what you called, Ralph, blowback. We are creating enemies rather than ending the enemies. Our effort to try to manipulate through military and financial power every government in the world is what's causing this animosity and hatred towards the United States. Think about this. For 2 centuries, there was no Islamic problem with the United States because we didn't have bases throughout the Middle East. We weren't going in and invading, Saddam Hussein, on behalf of a monarchy in Kuwait. We were not trying to manipulate every government, overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran and trying to prop up King Hussein with CIA money. But when we are financially and militarily supporting governments that are oppressing their people, the people get angry at the United States because we, in some way, become co-collaborators, if you will, with these oppressive regimes. So you're right, we're spending vast sums, $6 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq alone, to accomplish what? Even greater danger than if we had done nothing.
Bruce, it was the CIA's procedure before 9/11 to oppose torture and say, number one, it doesn't get us good intelligence. Number two, it's likely to get us false information, right?
That is correct. And that not only was the CIA's approach, that was the Department of Defense's approach in the interrogation by military intelligence, and it was the FBI's approach. And it was hardly a novel insight. If those who remember their history acknowledge that when Galileo was threatened with torture, he then confessed the Earth was the center of the universe. So you do not get accurate information. And the Senate Intelligence Committee report disclosed how many resources were wasted, running down false leads that were obtained by torturing the detainees who then confessed anything. So it actually made us less safe because we're wasting and squandering resources on false leads that wouldn't have been there if we hadn't engaged in torture in the first instance.
Now you're pressing for the release of 6,700 pages of what?
These are what we call the raw documents. We got an executive summary, but these are the actual emails, interrogation reports that were compiled over the course of years by the CIA and the intelligence community itself. So this is what would enable the public and law enforcement to discredit categorically and definitively the efforts to justify the torture techniques by those who are now in the agency, the John Brennan. So if we're going to have a serious investigation, we need the 6,700 pages. An executive summary is not going to satisfy the legal standards necessary to get the evidence into a court of law.
Who owns those 6,700 pages other than a taxpayer, the Senate or the administration?
Well, I mean, it's rather odd. The Senate clearly owns the initial document, but Senator Feinstein, when she was the chairwoman before the new Congress convened, gave copies of the 6,700 to various agencies in the executive branch. So I guess they have their own copies as well, and it's possible to pursue those under the Freedom of Information Act. It probably would claim classification or some kind of defense, and it oftentimes requires years to litigate these FOIA cases. But there's no doubt that the Senate itself, if it wished, can, under Supreme Court precedent, release all the documents with impunity. They're shielded by the speech or debate clause from any kind of investigation by the executive branch, any claim that they violated the Espionage Act or otherwise, which I say makes it, in my judgment, so disgusting, if you will, that the Senate, with our taxpayers' money, spend 6-7 years compiling this investigation, enabling us to know what our government is doing, a fundamental right that goes back to the Declaration of Independence. Government by the consent of the governed means you got to know what your government is doing, and yet there it just is secret. And we also know that, at least with regard, Ralph, to these claims, if you have to disclose these kinds of documents, then all sorts of retaliation will occur abroad. And that, of course, was said with regard to the initial executive summary, that if we released it, then all of our embassies would be blown up, all of our consuls would be burned down, there'd be havoc abroad, and our embassy personnel would be attacked. Well, have you read a single story after the executive summary indicating any of that has happened? No. And so we need to give very little weight, a grain of salt to these claims that if you release this publicly, then there'll be these terrible, terrible ramifications abroad. In my judgment, if we hold ourselves accountable to the rule of law, it'll inspire pride abroad of how the United States sticks to the rule of law, even if it's to its own immediate short-term disadvantage and paints us in a bad light. We have warts like everybody else, and the more we acknowledge them, I think the greater respect we will command abroad.
Bruce, you've testified over 200 times before Senate and House committees, so you know the Congress pretty well. You've worked with Congressman Walter Jones on constitutional observances and the war-making powers. You've worked with Congressman McGovern from Massachusetts, a Democrat. Why don't you describe the abdication of Congress here, which is very much at the core of how we have a runaway presidency, how we're getting in trouble all over the world, how we're diverting trillions of dollars of public budgets that can better America into destruction abroad that's only increasing our adversaries. Why don't you tell our listeners and bring in Guantanamo, one of the few areas where Congress asserts itself, but in the wrong way, about the role of Congress here.
Well, Congress clearly is totally derelict in its obligation to follow its constitutional responsibilities. And I've spoken to numerous members of Congress who are totally frustrated with the leadership. And this is leadership both on the House and Senate side, both Republicans and Democrats. And the audience needs to know that there's only one final check on a president that's bent upon limitless power. That's called impeachment. That's called bribery, treason, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And you may recall in 2006, Nancy Pelosi, for political reasons, says impeachment's off the table. This is with Bush and Cheney. And then we saw what the emboldened effect that had. And then with regard to Obama, John Boehner said impeachment is off the table. So you wipe that out. You're telling the president you can do anything you want with impunity. We will never retaliate, no matter how many constitutional violations that you wish to perpetrate. And it is an effort, and I was up in Congress yesterday to describe the motive. Why is this happening? It's because we now have a leadership that wants no responsibility for anything And then if things go bad, to criticize the president. Well, they don't have an authorization, certainly not under the Constitution, to avoid or escape responsibility. They should be resigning their offices if they don't want to vote on those issues that the Constitution entrusts exclusively to Congress, and especially the war power issues. Speaker Boehner, the majority leader in the House and the Senate, once it was Harry Reid, now it's Mitch McConnell, they won't even permit a congressional debate on the issue of war against the Islamic State, a war against Syria. They won't even permit a debate. And both Boehner and Mitch McConnell said, we aren't even going to consider legislation unless the president drafts the legislation and gives it to us, and then we might take a look at it. Well, it is the congressional obligation to decide on war and peace, not the president's. And the reason isn't academics, because the Congress, unlike the president, doesn't confront a conflict of interest. They don't get anything out of gratuitous, purposeless wars. They have to impose taxes, or they've got to borrow. They confront secrecy. Nobody in Congress ever got an obelisk built after them because of a war. And the Founding Fathers were unanimous in saying we can't let one person or even a group, the President and the Senate, get us into war. We know there will be fighting purposeless wars because during wartime, the President gets the jingoism, the President gets the money, he gets the secrecy, he gets the footprints in the sands of time. And all history teaches that executive officials are the ones inclined to go to war for no purpose other than to impoverish the people. And that's why Congress has that power. And the Congress, when it's abdicating that authority, trying to block off the efforts of a Jim McGovern or Walter Jones to have a debate, really should be removed from office themselves. Members of Congress can impeach like the president, but it's not likely, given the current makeup. But the American people need to be hammering, writing into members, you need to vote on these issues. You're the one who's accountable, and your loyalty is to the Constitution, not to your political party. But that's the frustration up there at present, Ralph. I'm trying to organize what I could call a constitutional war caucus on the House and the Senate side that at least would composed of those members who they can't get a committee, but at least can have some kind of a voice that's audible that objects to this fecklessness by the House and Senate leadership.
Bruce, just to be concrete now, explain how the total abdication, unprecedented, I think, of Congress vis-a-vis Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama getting us into this mess in Libya and the consequences for Libya and Central Africa. This is a perfect example that what Bruce is talking about, listeners, is not some constitutional technicality here. It has very real consequences and blowback on our country. Explain that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the audience needs to remember that the invasion, the war against Libya occurred shortly after Colonel Gaddafi abandoned weapons of mass destruction. And he was a strong ally in fighting al-Qaeda or Islamic State because he's a secular guy. So could you imagine the signal that it sends to other nuclear powers or those who have nuclear ambition, Iran and North Korea? Why are we going to war against somebody who's now turned in our favor on international terrorism and WMD? So we went in. We overthrew Gaddafi. We had no idea of how we were going to have an exit strategy. We have now, years later, we have no functional government. You have two parliaments, one in Tobruk, one in Tripoli. All of the conventional weapons that Gaddafi had are now spewed all over the Middle East into the hands of the Islamic extremists, include those who use them against Israel. There's no rule of law in Libya at present. We have, say, no democracy, no functioning government that's preventing the radicals from obtaining power, and the Libyan people, terrible suffering, 25, 50, 100,000 civilians are refugees. They've been killed, they've been deprived, they've been injured in this state of constant warfare. And remember, this great irony, Ralph, is we purportedly, the executive branch, Hillary Clinton purportedly went in as a humanitarian mission because we were going to save a handful from Gaddafi's tyranny. And we end up in a situation where hundreds of thousands now have been brutalized or killed because of our intervention. And it's just created greater perception abroad that we go in to Muslim countries and we decide on a whim to destroy people and just leave. And that creates huge resentment.
Total chaos now in Libya. Militias, warring, killings, attacks everywhere. No U.S. diplomat is safe there.
Yeah.
It spilled over in terms of Central Africa, Mali. This is Hillary's war. She's the one who pushed it even more. She pushed it against the wishes of Secretary of Defense Robert Gates.
Yeah, who said we had no interest in vote. That is correct.
Right.
And there wasn't even Islamic State now has gotten into Libya. It didn't even exist before. And you're right, it's bled over into probably genocide in the Central African Republic, weapons everywhere, 126 militias. It is a literal dystopia.
Now, I want to ask you, let's say I'm a law student. Was the war against Libya constitutionally voted on in the Congress? Yes or no?
No, there was no vote whatsoever.
Right. Okay. Were the funds authorized to implement the war, the bombings, etc., by Congress? Yes or no?
Well, they just used funds that were a general appropriation for the Defense Department. There were no earmarked funds for the war against Libya.
Neither authorized nor appropriated.
Correct.
This is probably the most extreme unilateral usurpation of congressional authority involving a foreign war in American history. True or false?
True. The most blatant, and it was combined, Ralph, not only in the particular instance, but it generated an opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel that asserted the president go to war anytime he wants in the name of regional stability or the credibility of the UN Security Council, which means limitless authorization to go to war anytime he feels like it, including Iran. And I'd add this element as well. At Nuremberg, post-World War II, the United States championed the idea that any war except justified by self-defense was a crime against peace, and that was utilized to sentence many Nazis to prison. Now, the war against Libya was surely not a war justified by self-defense, so it was a crime against peace under international law.
And yet there's a George Orwell element here, isn't there, Bruce? How did the White House describe it as not a war?
Well, they said that because none of our pilots, those who were flying sorties, bombing Libya into oblivion, were in danger of being shot down. Therefore, it wasn't war because we weren't putting our own soldiers in harm's way. The equivalent of saying that if we, in lieu of the bombing, launched the nuclear-tipped ICBMs into Libya and killed every living, breathing thing, it wouldn't be war because there was no immediate danger to the United States military.
Wasn't it mostly France and Great Britain who were doing the bombing?
Well, they participated, but we were the lead there. It's quite clear that without the United States in the lead, Great Britain and France wouldn't have been there. But even aside from that fact, that doesn't exonerate the United States if France and Great Britain want to commit a crime against peace. Well, that's their business. They need to be held accountable, too. We can only be responsible for what our government does, and our government was the one in the lead.
The French weren't doing most of the bombing? I thought Great Britain and France were doing most of the bombing. No,
I'm not denying that. They used our intelligence, but the fact that they did a lot of the bombing doesn't excuse the fact that we definitely did bombing. And it was our intelligence that was used to identify various and sundry targets. And I think it's fair to say that if the United States didn't acquiesce with what was going on, Great Britain and France never would have been there.
Mr. Fein, do you think that Obama and Hillary and Bush and Cheney should be tried as war criminals?
Well, if we're going to be true to the Nuremberg Tribunal, the answer is yes, because we also had an illegal war in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was not threatening the United States in 2003. It was a gratuitous, purposeless war. And if Adolf Hitler could be charged, or his minions charged, for crimes of aggression, wars against peace against Poland or the Czechoslovakia, because they weren't threatening, despite the fact that Hitler's defense would have been, the Sudeten Germans were being persecuted, and I had to do this for a humanitarian reason. If we're going to apply any standard of international law, these are crimes against peace.
On the sanctions, Bruce, Congress and the White House big on sanctions. What's the limit to sanctions that deprive people of health and safety? In other words, sanctions against governments, sanctions against military, those are allowed by international law. What about sanctions that affect people, that kill infants, that starve people, that take away health care, that withhold pharmaceuticals, catheters? What's the limit when they talk about more serious sanctions against Iran and the people of Iran are suffering?
Yeah. Well, it's a little complicated. I think that historically, Ralph, a nation unilaterally, without obliging others, could decide not to trade with some country. I mean, we tried that with the Non-Intercourse Acts in the early 1800s with Napoleon. But what happens today is, under Chapter 7 of the UN Treaty, we have these sanctions that are made international in scope by the Security Council votes. And because we've got a globalized economy, when you basically order an international boycott of a country like Iran, you're going to end up harming, you'll know that you're going to be harming, if not killing, countless civilians. I mean, we had an estimate when there were international sanctions against Iraq that 500,000 children under 5 had died because of the sanctions. A casualty toll that seemed to leave then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright totally undisturbed. She said, well, it was worth it. So there's a general principle about international conflict called proportionality, which is, the sanctions, the initiatives that are undertaken should be proportional insofar as they inflict harm on civilians or risk harm to civilians, should be proportional to the importance of the objective, the military objective that's at stake here. And when you have the literally millions of ordinary people whose health, safety, and welfare is immediately affected by an international boycott, that certainly skates the edge of being a war crime.
One last question. We're listening to Bruce Fein, international law, constitutional expert, author, former government official, constant witness before congressional committees. Bruce, what do you think of the Congress asserting itself in foreign policy by inviting, once again, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to address a joint session of Congress in March without going through the White House? What's your view on that and the general alliance between the U.S. and Israel?
The first observation is it seems odd that Congress, so far as they're seeking expert opinion, would summon Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he was also a witness in 2003 about Iraq invasion, and he insisted that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He was going to use them, and that the cure for Middle East ailments and convulsions was to democratize the entire region. Statements that turned out to be utterly and completely ridiculous. And if you could democratize the region, you'd ask, well, how come you haven't democratized Hamas? An international terrorist organization. So the first question is, why are you asking someone who's been totally wrong on these issues? And secondly, why would you ask someone who clearly is coming to testify about Iran and he has a conflict of interest? There's no doubt that Israel feels that they want the United States behind them if they attack or otherwise try to confront Iran over their nuclear ambitions or otherwise. So he's not an impartial outside expert. Third, it's also quite clear that the motivation for John Boehner, since he doesn't have any interest in any other area of national security, including exercising a decision on going to war or not, is doing this as a political stunt. He thinks that because Netanyahu coming to Congress without communicating with the president, he'll try to make a rift between the executive branch and Israel, and because the Israeli lobby, so to speak, through American Israel Public Affairs Committee is so powerful, this is a way that Boehner thinks he can wound the president. That's what his concern is. He doesn't really care about Israel. I don't think he even cares about Iran. This is just really an obnoxious game of political gotcha that no prior precedent. Earlier times when persons like that ilk of comments with the acceptance or urging of the president rather than trying to circumvent the executive branch here. And it's unfortunate that, the serious issues of national security don't ever get debated by Congress, and ones that turn into a political football do. And if anything, it's another example, in my judgment, of total, complete congressional irresponsibility in thinking that all national security is a game between the blue team and the red team, and America's interests get sold down the river. And we will not survive long under that strategy.
And very quickly, Bruce, Israel's policy toward Palestine.
Well, if we applied ordinary standards of international law, they basically have the right, assert the right to detain without accusation or trial. It's like,
Hello? Hello, hello.
Hello.
Netanyahu got to him.
I know. Are you there?
No, you got to get him back.
All right.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
Let's call him back.
Isn't that ironic?
Yeah. I mean, it's not, I don't know if it's ironic anymore.
That's right.
Yeah.
Americans Tax Reform.
Yes, this is Steve Scrovan from Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We were talking to Bruce Fein and somehow got disconnected.
Okay, I'll patch you through.
Thanks.
Hello? Oh, did we get cut off?
Hi, Bruce.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't Netanyahu cut us off.
Oh. It was a
Hey, Bruce,
technical glitch. Yeah.
Right. Okay, let me ask this question once again, just in conclusion. Bruce, what's your view of Israel's policies toward the Palestinians?
They kind of treat the West Bank there as the equivalent of Guantanamo Bay. They detain freely without accusation or trial. And they also have a doctrine of guilt by association. If you have someone who they believe is engaged in terrorism, you don't just punish the terrorist, you destroy his entire house. So innocent civilians get killed at the same time. And also, if we look at the overall approach, they're alarmist over any nuclear ambitions of Iran, and I'm not in favor of proliferation, and I totally ignore the fact that, Israel's got hundreds of nuclear weapons, and unlike Iran, Israel has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So we have, a huge double standards. We blink at Israel's violations because of political pressure, and I think that further discredits the United States in the Middle East because it's obvious we're not playing an even-handed game.
Two-state solution?
I don't have any objection. Two-state solution is fine on its face. It depends upon, what the second state is going to be. And those are details that haven't really gone very far. I don't think Israel has much interest in two-state solution. Certainly Netanyahu does not, because at present they control everything with relative impunity. They have more and more arms by the year rather than fewer and fewer, and therefore they view that time is on their side. I think internally it's going to come to a huge wreck. But in the short run, I think we're going to see a stalemate and chronic warfare, much to the disadvantage of all the civilians in that area.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for your time and your contributions to this discussion. Do you want to give a website for your group so people want to learn more about what you all are doing? Yes,
my website is www.brucefeinlaw.com. That's BRUCEFEINLAW.com. Repeat it, www.brucefeinlaw.com, sort of a hub for all the things that I'm doing.
And you helped draw up the articles of impeachment for Bill Clinton, right?
Yes, I did, and I also proposed articles of impeachment against both George W. Bush and Barack Obama for flouting the Constitution.
So when
I
we
was
say
involved in Nixon, so I've been involved in every impeachment since Nixon.
When people say throw the bums out, they really don't mean it. You mean it.
Yeah, that is right. Even-handed justice. My view is, more than anything else, we're all Americans, far more than we're Republicans or Democrats and independents. And when we lose that attachment to America and what's in the interest of our country and the rule of law, that's the beginning of the decline and fall.
Right. They have us convinced that throwing the bums out wouldn't be good for the country. It would be the best thing that ever happened.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. Well said, Bruce. Thank you very much, Bruce Fein. And we'll now move on to our rest of our show. Thanks very much, Bruce.
You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back right after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph Nader. Ralph, this week, the United States of America celebrated its most sacred religious holiday, the Super Bowl. Did you watch the Super Bowl this week, on Sunday?
Yeah, I watched it when it started. I didn't watch all the previews for 4 hours, but 113 million Americans were reported to have watched the Super Bowl. That is more time than those Americans, if you'll pardon a digression, then they'll spend an entire year watching an institution that spends 22% of their money, can expose them to all kinds of harm, send their children off to war, called the U.S. Congress. Back to the Super Bowl.
It's bread and circus.
The Super Bowl was very interesting. It was a terrific game, by the way. But the Super Bowl was interesting for another way. Usually, anything serious is taboo. That is, the announcers aren't not supposed to talk about anything serious, and the halftime is totally entertainment. Well, on this Super Bowl, the 49th, two serious issues came onto the screen. One was a minute ad by the NFL on domestic abuse and football players. Now, some people say, well, that's just window dressing. That is a huge breakthrough for the National Football League. And they basically have admitted that they have been laggard in this area. They've allowed football players to get away with beating up their wives and girlfriends and children year after year. And now it's on the table. And proper names are being associated with abuse, actual football players. There's going to be more punishment. The NFL has established a major domestic abuse prevention program involving the football players and their families. So that's progress number one. Progress number two is that when one or two of the players was reported to have a concussion, the usual announcer would say over the years, Johnny Jones was shaken up, he's on the sideline. This time, the announcer said, because of all the reporting and studies on concussions, this time they said, so-and-so appeared to have a concussion, and if so, he will not be coming back for the rest of the game. So again, that's progress number two, because concussions and brain damage for retired players, horrible problem. And not only that, but concussions are now being studied on 11-year-old football players in middle school, high school, college. It's an epidemic that is threatening the very existence of football as we know it. And public opinion is even turning against football, not a majority, but far more in the pre-concussion, put it under the rug days. So that's progress number two. So I think things are happening because the press is starting to do its job, because people who are abused are starting to publicly protest, and because there's becoming a more and more serious attitude that sports is not only just sports. It's big business, it's profits, it's censorship, it's repression, it's concussions, it's excessive intrusion on letting kids have their own childhood. It's all about profit. It's all about winning. And that's going to be the subject of our next report next week with Ken Reed's new book that is coming out in February, the policy director for our leagueoffans.org. So I hope you listen in. What did you think of the Super Bowl?
I was in India, so I had to get up at 5 a.m. to watch it. It was on live here. I didn't get the American commercials, though. I got Indian commercials. It's mostly for NBA games. They also show NBA games here. So I really got it without all the hoopla. They did have the halftime show, but it was really kind of purely the game. So I didn't even see the domestic abuse.
What?
Commercial.
You missed $4.25 million for each 30-second ad by Budweiser, et cetera? Imagine $4.25 million for 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay. So what did you think, David?
Well, that's what your average. That's what a hedge fund manager makes.
Yeah. I wanted to pick up on the domestic abuse thing. How much, in your opinion, Ralph, is that the NFL's responsibility? Isn't that a legal issue? Would any other corporation be held accountable for one of their employees committing domestic abuse? How is the NFL different?
That's a very good question. The NFL is treated as a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. Can you imagine that bizarre twist due to NFL lobbying in Congress years ago? So its own government, they can fine players for free speech. You know, if they don't show up at a press conference, as
Marshawn Lynch.
Marshawn Lynch said, Marshawn Lynch, the fullback for the Seattle Seahawks, he was not interested in showing up at news conferences, but he had to, and he would say, I'm here because I don't want to be fined. So they are a private government. They can fine, they can shut up people, they can suspend players without due process of law. But when it comes to domestic abuse, that is criminal law and tort law. That's outside the NFL. And you're right. The legal system has got to get more involved and not leave it up to the NFL.
Now, you don't watch the entire game. You're doing a crossword puzzle. You're signing letters. You're not just staring at the TV, Ralph, are you?
Well, I read the Sunday Washington Post during the football game because, let's face it, there's 1 hour of football on the Super Bowl, only 13 and a half minutes of actual play. Most people don't realize that. The rest is going back into the huddle, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't really have to watch full time.
I was actually on my laptop working on I was editing a script. So, yeah, and you're right. I didn't have any trouble keeping up.
How about you, David? Were you engaged in crossword puzzles?
I didn't watch. I'm not proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that I don't watch television, but I'm not proud of the fact that I missed the Super Bowl. I just had other things to do.
Why is that a matter of pride?
Well, Ralph,
you're not proud of that.
Ralph, give the number because it's kind of interesting. Two-thirds
of the American people did not watch the Super Bowl, including you. 1/3 did.
I'm a man of the people, Ralph. What can I say?
My view is this.
You're filibuster-proof.
My view is this. Sometimes you get a really thrilling game, and this was a thrilling game. But secondly, if it's an event that's that important to 113 million people, it's my business to watch it.
Right.
It's my business to try to understand it. That's why we have leagueoffans.org, a citizen advocacy group that's trying to represent fans.
Right. Speaking of television, the Federal Trade Commission, not the FCC, the Federal Trade Commission just celebrated its 100th birthday. You are personally responsible for the overhaul that took place in the 70s. And I remember a report that I believe Richard Nixon's son-in-law was working for you at the time. Wasn't Chris Cox?
Yeah. Edward Cox was part of what the Washington Post called the Nader Raiders team on the Federal Trade Commission to investigate it from the outside inside. And so they roamed the corridors of this wonderful building on Pennsylvania Avenue. The Federal Trade Commission was supposed to protect consumers from monopolies, deceptive practices, etc., cheating of consumers. And it was lying down on the job. It wasn't doing it. And so we exposed it in a report. And Edward Cox had not yet married Patricia Nixon, but he was going to the White House when he was also working on the Federal Trade Commission study for us. So I think it's a perfect example of how young people can do serious work, expose a government agency, get a lot of press, testify before Congress, and actually change the agency and made it much better.
Well, where is it now? Because I remember in that report, I believe you talked about Geritol. Am I correct?
Yes.
Now the Attorney General of New York is cracking down on supplements. Like 4 major chains now are going to pull them from their shelves because they're not safe and they have deceptive claims. And as I'm reading this article in this week's Times, I'm thinking, where's the FTC on this?
It probably said, you go and do it, Attorney General of New York. We've got a tiny budget. We've got our hands full, but we'll cooperate with you. And depending on what you find, we may then exert enforcement power across the country beyond the boundaries of New York State. But what the Attorney General of New York is charging 4 national retailers, Target, Walgreens, Walmart, and GNC, the Attorney General investigators found that 4 out of 5 of the herbal supplement products did not contain any of the herbs on their label. The test showed that, and I'm quoting from the New York Times today, the test showed that pills labeled medicinal herbs often contain little more than cheap fillers like powdered rice, asparagus, and houseplants, and in some cases, substances that could be dangerous to those persons with allergies. End quote. There you are. How long does it take before we put a state cop on the corporate crime beat?
Right.
Or a federal cop?
It took the New York Times to do the legwork on that. There was no government agency finding that out. The Attorney General...
Good point. That's why the press is the leading source of vigilance over government and corporate misbehavior. Thank goodness for the New York Times. Most newspapers have laid off investigative reporters.
Let's take some listener questions, shall we?
Sure.
I'll take the first one. Mike Hart writes, these are Facebook questions. He writes, please enlighten us on the invasionary events of geoengineering.
Well, this is in the news today. Geoengineering is the arrogance of scientists and engineers and their followers who think they can geoengineer the planet with flurries of crystals, etc. We can dewarm the Earth and combat climate change. Well, if there's ever an initiative by mankind that can have unintended consequences, spell it geoengineering. Of course, it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to study it. But to basically say, as some of the geoengineering fanatics or adherents are saying, we don't have to stop burning oil, coal, gas. We don't have to move faster to renewable solar, wind power, efficiency, because in the long term, we can geoengineer the earth, continue business as usual, and thwart dangerous climate change. Now, I must admit, that is an extreme pro-geoengineering view. But a less extreme is one that will use a lot of tax dollars for utter nonsense. A lot of tax dollars for going on a pathway that is extremely risky, extremely speculative, extremely long range in terms of anything being done if it's successful, instead of doing what we have to do now, use energy efficiently, motor vehicles, lighting, heating, air conditioning, huge ability to prevent the need to generate energy and electricity because we wouldn't be wasting it and be saving money to boot and reducing greenhouse gases, and a global conversion to applying the multiple manifestations of solar energy and geothermal energy for the permanent source of energy on planet Earth.
Naomi Wolf has written a book about this, and I've read excerpts where she talks about geoengineering that's going on right now to combat climate change. They'll dump certain types of iron into the ocean to remove certain acidity, and then whales change their migration habits, which wreaks havoc on fishermen. And she's saying that attempts to make it rain and push back the sunlight will cause flooding 6,000 miles away, and we'll end up fighting wars because one country will be accusing another country of flooding them through their geoengineering. It's pretty apocalyptic.
It's sheer madness, and a lot of scientists and engineers believe it's sheer madness. At any rate, anything for a government contract.
Yeah. Ralph, Jennifer Pelkey writes, what, if anything, does Ralph think and have to say about overpopulation and the need for population control/reduction measures?
Well, we certainly don't want to do it the Chinese way, which is force women not to have children. We don't want to do it the Romanian way under the dictator before the fall of the Kremlin, who forced women to have more children. And so we want to use good information, good advice, good contraceptive access. And as incomes go up, the birth rate goes down. In Europe now, the problem is they can't replenish their people. The birth rate is below the replenishment level. In Italy, it's seriously below.
Does that mean that overpopulation is not a problem at all?
Let me put it this way. As economies advance and people get more income, they have smaller families. That's even showing itself in one of the highest population increase countries in the world, Kenya, for example, has had quite a sharp decline. Also, when you reduce infant mortality, it reduces the incentive of couples to have more children because they know they're going to lose them to infant mortality. Secondly, let's not get apoplectic about population growth, though. There are certain trends that are very beneficial now in terms of reducing the rate of population growth on the globe. They used to say we were going to be 15 billion in 60 years. Now they think in 60 years it may reach 10 billion from a little over 7 billion people. But the key ratio, the key equation is what kind of resources do people use? Obviously, if they're using coal, gas, and oil, 1 billion people can do more damage to the planet than 3 billion people who are using wind power, solar thermal, solar voltaic, and energy efficiency technologies. So we have to keep that in mind. But the trends are all in the proper direction. It may not be fast enough for some people, but we've got to avoid the Romanian dictatorship approach of forcing women to have more children and the Chinese dictatorship approach of forcing women to abort themselves and only have one child, which is now being changed to 2 children in China.
Was forced sterilization once legal in this country?
It was legal to people who were considered mentally disabled. There's this horrific comment by Oliver Wendell Holmes in a Supreme Court decision, Justice Holmes approved the forced sterilization of a prisoner with the now notorious phrase, 4 generations of idiots are enough.
Wow.
Next question, and this is, I don't know, maybe a little obscure, but I'm going to ask it anyway. This is from Michael Kadushin, and he says, explain the difference between a rival 3 courts of common law and maritime courts of commerce, the court registry investment system. This is the one we're probably going to go out on. So, if you can breathe some life into that, Ralph.
This question seems like a question that is more appropriate for members of the Mensa Society playing a super intellectual Jeopardy game. That's my way of saying I don't know the answer to it.
Well, it just so happens I can answer this.
David Feldman can answer
because
this.
I'm an expert on maritime law.
Well, this actually turned out to be a good way to go out, where Ralph's saying, I don't know. We very seldom get that. So we've come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. David in New York, Ralph in Washington, D.C. I'm still in Mumbai, India, and it's slowly becoming a hostage situation. But join us again next week. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Steve. Thank the listeners. And let's have more radio stations listen to this hour and get engaged. We'll keep giving you websites, telephone numbers, addresses, so you can connect.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice?